Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, 3 topics I'm here to share with you. I know one of my requested top 10 list videos to share with you guys today. Now, for this particular video, I will be sharing what are currently my top 10 favorite published Capcom video games of all time. Now, this idea was sent to me by one of my regulars and OG fans going by the name of Vampire A, so I just want to thank you once again for sending me another pretty awesome idea. And I gotta admit, doing some research for this particular list was actually quite challenging because there were actually a number of games that I remember from my childhood that I didn't realize were published from Capcom, so that made this list actually quite difficult to really construct. But there's a lot of really great games, so I think this is easily one of the best top 10 lists in general that I've ever come up with. So if you do happen to enjoy this video by the end, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to track me on all my future videos. And remember, if you guys have any ideas for top 10 list videos or reaction videos or ranking videos, just discussion videos in general, please let me know what they are in the comments down below, and I will be sure to get them up as soon as I can, as well as to give you a shout out. So starting off with the first entry on my list, taking the number 10 spot, is a game that I loved this game as a kid, and I even loved it a little bit more when they remastered it much later on in my life. But heck, I didn't even realize that this was a Capcom game, and it's the only game on this list that actually was released before I was born. In fact, so much so before I was even conceived, and that is in the form of the 1989 NES game titled DuckTales, as well as the remastered version that they released like some time ago. But yeah, DuckTales. As a 90s kid, I love DuckTales, so it actually took me a little bit longer to find out when I was a kid that they actually did make a DuckTales game for the NES. And I do believe that there was also a Game Boy version that actually had a pretty cool soundtrack, with the moon theme being iconic even to this day. Yeah, so DuckTales. This was a great straight-up platformer. I loved playing as Scrooge McDuck and going on those crazy adventures. The TV show was just amazing, had an amazing intro. Not really much to say, and I think the remastered version did an incredible job of just kind of updating it and allowing me to revisit it again. So, I mean, there's really not much I can say about DuckTales, but yeah, this is kind of crazy that this actually came out in September of 1989, and I was born in September 1990. So, yeah, DuckTales. NES, as well as the remastered version, is going to take the number 10 spot on my list. Now, taking the number 9 spot is going to have to go to Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles. Now, I have to admit, I didn't get a chance to replay this game until it came out for the PlayStation Move on PlayStation 3, because this game originally came out on the Wii, but a lot of Wii games did eventually get transferred over to the PlayStation because it had the Move motion controllers. I really like this game. It's a on-rail shooter, and you know, a lot of arcade games are pretty much on-rail shooters. And this, for the most part, kind of follows the story of Leon and Krauser on a mission to, I believe, somewhere in Mexico or somewhere in Brazil. I can't quite remember exactly where it was. And it also kind of goes over the story of what happened. It kind of retells Resident Evil Code Veronica, which I hope they remake that one. That should have been remade long before Resident Evil 4 ever did. So it kind of allows you to just kind of see the backstory. Now you have to remember that Darkside Chronicles actually came out after Resident Evil 4 did, so I did like seeing that a time period where Leon and Krauser were actually friends and allies. So I liked seeing that period. And I thought the story, it wasn't too incredible, but I did think that it kind of answered a few questions about some characters that we didn't quite know about, as well as make some necessary changes in the storyline that was already established. But yeah, that's really all I can say about this one. It was a pretty solid on-rail shooter. I do like Darkside Chronicles a lot more than Umbrella Chronicles, even though they're pretty much the same game, just set with different characters in different time periods. But yeah, Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles, easily my favorite Resident Evil on-rail shooter, and a solid entry on this list. Now, taking the number 8 spot is a game that I feel a little bit dirty adding, simply because of what it is. But number 8 on my list is going to have to go to Street Fighter 2. Now, the reason I feel dirty adding this is because, as someone who is a hardcore Mortal Kombat fan, I consider it to be a single act of treason if you play both these games. You have to pick one. These are the two kings of the fighting game category in gaming. You either are a Mortal Kombat fan or a Street Fighter fan. You cannot be a fan of both. I'm a firm believer of that. And for the longest time, for over 25 years, I've been strictly Mortal Kombat. So much so that I've never even touched a controller that has been attached to a Street Fighter game. I'm that committed to Mortal Kombat. However, when I was a kid, before I got access to Mortal Kombat, I did have Street Fighter 2. So there was a time where I was a Street Fighter fan. And more so I actually had access to a Mortal Kombat cabinet when I was growing up. When I went to a daycare center, and we actually had a arcade cabinet section. And the most popular game in there was Street Fighter 2, and I was playing that like crazy when I was a kid, and I had a lot of fun with it. And when it would eventually come out for Super Nintendo, when I got access to a Super Nintendo, I was also playing that. But again, this was a little bit before my cousin would introduce me to Mortal Kombat, and then the rest of my life is pretty much history. But Mortal Kombat 2, there's so many versions of Mortal Kombat 2. There's like Turbo and then Torment Edition, so there's so many variations. So I'm just sticking to strictly Street Fighter 2 as a whole in general. It's easily still to this day one of the most iconic fighting games of all time. It really was the game that really kind of made Street Fighter a household name, because there was a first Street Fighter game that a lot of people don't really know too much about, or most people haven't played, but like Street Fighter 2 really elevated it to the status of one of the greatest tournament fighting games of all time, and it's very, very well deserved. But because I am a Mortal Kombat fan, I feel like I can't put it any higher than the number 8 spot. I feel comfortable. So I'm not ashamed to admit that there was a time where I was a Street Fighter fan, but like, I can't give Street Fighter too much credit because I'm a Mortal Kombat person, and I don't want to feel like a traitor. So yeah, that's why I'll give Street Fighter 2 the number 8 spot on my list. Taking the number 7 spot is gonna have to go to Mega Man Battle Network. Now, I don't really consider myself to be a big classic Mega Man fan. I played like a few of them when I was younger, but I never really got into the franchise. It really wasn't until the Battle Network series was released in cartoon form on WB that's the one that I was most invested into. And so I remember playing the Battle Network games on Game Boy Advance a lot, and I really liked the television show that went with it. So I just love the grid gameplay style. I liked the customizations, had a lot of RPG elements, and I really generally did like the story. And I think there was like some video that Def Battle did like many years ago where they kind of revealed that the Battle Network version of Mega Man was probably the strongest, and like that's one of the few Def Battle matchups that I actually enjoyed seeing, and I wouldn't argue against, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, which is why the Battle Network games have always been a series that I've always been a fan of, and which is why I think it's worthy of being added on this list. I didn't get to play all of them, but I did play most of the Battle Network games. But the first one in general really sticks out to me the most, which is why it's going to take the number 7 spot on my list. Taking the number 6 spot is going to go to a X-Men game. Now, as a 90s kid and someone who was more attached to Nintendo than Sega, my brother was more of a Sega person and I was more of a Nintendo person. He had his X-Men game on the Sega Genesis, and I had X-Men Mutant Apocalypse on the Super NES, and this, even to this day, still, I would easily put, if I had to make a list of like top 5 favorite X-Men games, this would be in there, because X-Men is without question my favorite superhero team in comic books of all time. Way better than the Justice League, and certainly way better than the Avengers in my opinion. This was easily awesome platformer, had a great cast of characters, it was very challenging, great boss fights, great music, great level design, great atmosphere. This was just an overall fantastic X-Men game, and I don't really have too many complaints about it. It's worthy of being pretty high on this list, which is why it's taking the number 6 spot on my list. Well, now it's time to enter the Big 5, and I assure you, this point moving forward, it's really going to jump kind of semi back and forth between 2 franchises. Obviously, it being Resident Evil and Devil May Cry, so you better prepare yourself. So number 5 on my list is going to have to go to Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. All the Devil May Cries on here are special editions, strictly. So, Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. Now, I like Devil May Cry 4, and which is why I never understood why the DMC game was ever made, because, quite frankly, I always thought that Devil May Cry franchise was always in a good spot, even by the period of 4. My only complaint that I ever had with Devil May Cry 4 was that you played the game moving forward as Nero, and then you played it backwards as Dante, and it was always a lot more challenging and a lot more fun playing as Dante than Nero, because I always felt that Nero with his demonic arm made the game feel a bit too easy. He's still a fantastic character, but I just felt that the game was just too easy playing as Nero. So when the special edition version came out, I revisited, and I thought it was even better, because not only did it give you the option to play as Virgil, who's by far my favorite video game, like Devil May Cry character of all time, and easily in my top 5 favorite video game characters of all time. Anytime you add Virgil to a game, that just makes your Devil May Cry game all the more better, which is why it's criminal that we haven't had a solo Virgil game out yet, because he absolutely can hold his own in his own game. He doesn't need to just pop up in a Devil May Cry game. He could actually be the protagonist of his own game, and I think it would be incredible. It would easily be a game of the year like contender, at least for me. Not only that, but you also got to play as Trish, which you couldn't do that until Devil May Cry 2. If you beat the game, which a lot of people hate. I don't hate Devil May Cry 2. And you also got to play as Lady. So you pretty much were able to play through the campaign as Trish and Lady, or just strictly as Virgil, or as Dante and Nero. I don't think they added too much, but like be able to revisit it. They kind of updated some of the visuals. I don't think they changed the combat all that much, but it was just a great updated version of a great game. So that's why Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition is going to take the number 5 spot on my list. Taking the number 4 spot is going to have to go to Resident Evil 5. Now, Resident Evil 5 has actually been kind of controversial as of recently because of some controversial comments made by a certain journalist from IGN, and heck, I even did my own video recently. But heck, I'm going to say this. I personally don't think Resident Evil 5 needs to be remade. If they think that it can't be remade, that's fine, but due to non-racial reasons. To this day, Resident Evil 5 is still, even after all these years, my all-time favorite co-op video game of all time. When the demo came out, everyone was playing it. Everybody was playing that when it came out during that period of time. And me and my brother were playing that like crazy. So when the game actually came out and we were both able to play through the game together, it was an amazing experience. And to this day, it is probably the second most played Resident Evil game that I've ever had. And I've had an insane amount of fun playing Resident Evil 4. Yeah, I'll admit, did it kind of venture a little bit more into the action side than Resident Evil 4 did? Yeah, it wasn't quite as bad as in Resident Evil 6, where there was like an entire campaign where it didn't even feel like a Resident Evil game. It felt strictly like a third-person shooter. But I do think that Resident Evil 5 had a solid mix of, it had some horror aspects and some action aspects. It felt more like 70% action and 30% horror, but the horror element was there. And I would even say that Resident Evil 5 has probably the best use of Wesker that we've had in the entire franchise. And remember, Wesker is supposed to be the main villain of the entire franchise, and up to this point, he really hadn't been very active since Code Veronica. So to bring him back and make him the primary villain, I think was a great choice. And the fact that we have not had any reintroduction into Sheva's character is completely criminal. How do you have a character be 50% of the reason that your main villain of the franchise goes out and you haven't even considered bringing her back? I think is completely disrespectful to her character, because I think that Sheva was a great entry and new character for the franchise, and I would love to see her come back. But yeah, Resident Evil 5. Fantastic Resident Evil game. I will always defend it. And it will always remain my all-time favorite co-op video game of all time, which is why it's more than worthy of taking the number 4 spot on my list. Okay, now that we are at number 3, these next 3 entries are members of my legendary 10 out of 10 club. All 3 of these are 10 out of 10s. But the first one on this list is going to have to go to Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. Devil May Cry 3 was already an incredible game. For the longest time, it was like the best Devil May Cry game of all time. But once they added Virgil and like a few little cutscenes, that was enough to push it to a 10 out of 10. Before the special edition, I would have given Devil May Cry 3 a 9 because it was just an overall incredible game, incredible combat, awesome story, badass soundtrack, and amazing visuals, and a great origin story for Dante's character to show what he was like before the events of Devil May Cry 1. But once you added Virgil in there and showed off his gameplay style and just a little bit more about him, I wish they'd had like more cutscenes involving his character. That was enough to give it that little boost it needed to make it into the 10 out of 10 club, which is why Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition takes number 3 spot on my list. Taking the number 2 spot on my list is going to have to go to Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition. The exact same story as Devil May Cry 3 in the sense that, heck, Devil May Cry 5, awesome game. On its own for the PlayStation 4, it's a 9 out of 10. But once you added Virgil playable in there, add a couple little bits in here, that was just the boost it needed to push Devil May Cry 5 Special Edition to the 10 out of 10 club. Now, I will say this. I think on its own, if you took all the Special Editions out of there, I still think that Devil May Cry 5 actually still would be the best Devil May Cry game of all time. Not only did you have 3 completely different campaigns, they all had their own paths, they had all their own boss fights. In fact, there were even some sections that if you were playing this online, you could actually fight alongside other players who were controlling characters during certain sections. So it kind of had a semi-co-op online feeling. It wasn't definitive, but the element was there, and I think that addition was also great. And I think the story was fantastic. It didn't repeat a lot of the same mistakes that prior Devil May Cry games had made, where you just played through the game as alternate characters, but it was the same campaign. I think that's the mistake that Devil May Cry 3 had, which is why I think that game it held it back just a little bit when you were playing as Virgil. But it had a completely different campaign, which is something that they did with Lucia and Devil May Cry 2, which no one gives that credit for. No one gives Devil May Cry 2 credit that they actually had 2 discs, and they had 2 different campaigns. They had different paths, different weapons, different playstyles, different bosses. No one gives that game credit, and and this is something that even Devil May Cry 4 didn't do. So it's the fact that Devil May Cry 5 actually managed to learn from every interpretation, every prior game, from 1, 2, 3, and 4, and implement them into an incredible game, makes, in my opinion, Devil May Cry 5, even on its own, without the special edition, the best Devil May Cry game of all time. But that special edition gave it the boost it needed to be a 10 out of 10 game for me, which is why it's number 2 on this list. And taking the number 1 spot, my all-time favorite Capcom game of all time, may not surprise anybody, and it didn't need a special edition to do it, in the form of Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is not only my favorite Capcom game of all time, it's not only my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. On my 10 out of 10 list, it takes the number 5 spot. It is my 5th favorite video game of all time. It was the game that made me a Resident Evil fan to begin with, and it was actually the very, very, very first video game that ever legitimately scared me. In my entire life of being alive for 33 years, there have only been 3 games that have ever legitimately scared me. And Resident Evil 1 was the very first. I mean, this game revolutionized the entire genre. No one was using the over-shoulder angle. I mean, trust me, I absolutely hated the tank controls for the OG Resident Evil games, which make those games completely unplayable to the point where I've destroyed a couple of controllers, and even to this day, I still hate the OG Resident Evil games. And yes, some people say, oh, Resident Evil 4 still has tank controls, they just move the camera. It's like, well, that's the point. Just switching the camera makes the game so much easier to play. Now, look, I'm someone who refuses to even acknowledge the so-called remake because it doesn't feel like Resident Evil 4 to me, because I always thought that Resident Evil 4 in the OG version was perfect on its own. It didn't need an updated version. But I do acknowledge that, heck, some people do like the remake, and that's perfectly fine. But the OG will always be the true Resident Evil 4 for me. It had such a major impact on not just me as a gamer, but on the entire industry. There's a lot of games that are still using elements that were first innovated in this game. So out of any of these games, I would say that Resident Evil 4 had the biggest impact on not just its own franchise, but the entire gaming industry in general, which is why it's more than deserving as being the number 1 Capcom game on my list. So those are my list of my top 10 favorite Capcom games of all time. I would like to know, what are some of your favorite Capcom games? Let me know your list in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I'll see you all next time.